For today's video, we will be discussing about the inherent powers of the state. Specifically, we will be dealing on the following subtopics. 1. The definition of state. 2. The inherent powers of state. 3. The police power. 4. The power of eminent domain. 5. The power of taxation. And lastly, the limitation of the inherent powers of the state. So without further ado, let us first answer this question. What is a state? According to James Garner, the state is a community of persons, more or less numerous, occupying a definite portion of territory, completely free of external control, and possessing an organized government to which a great body of inhabitants render habitual obedience. The most common misconception of people is that the state is similar to government. The government is merely an instrumentality of the state through which the will of the state is implemented and realized. To continue, the state has a so-called inherent power. But what is an inherent power, and why is it called as inherent powers? So inherent power refers to the power of states which can be exercised even without a constitution granting it. In other words, even in the absence of law, these powers would still continue to exist and can still be exercised by the state. So what are the inherent powers of the state? The inherent powers of the state are the following: the police power, the power of eminent domain, and the power of taxation. Let us begin first with police power. So what is a police power? In general sense, police power is the power of the state to make, ordain, and establish all manner of wholesome and reasonable laws, statutes, and ordinances as they shall judge for the good and welfare of the commonwealth and of the subjects of the same. It includes maintenance of peace and order, protection of life, liberty, and property, and the promotion of general welfare. In the case of Murphy versus Motok, the Philippine Supreme Court articulated the definition of police power as the power to promote the general welfare and public interest, to enact such laws in relation to persons and property as may promote public health, public morals, public safety, and the general welfare of each inhabitant. It is also a power to preserve public order and to prevent offenses against the state, and to establish for the intercourse of citizen with citizen those rules of good manners and good neighborhood calculated to prevent conflict of rights. So in light of the foregoing, we can simply deduce that police power is the power of the state to promote public welfare by restraining and regulating some of our rights, such as the use of liberty and property. The basis of the exercise of police power are grounded on these two legal principles. 1. The salus populi suprema est lex, or the welfare of the people is the supreme law, and sic uteri tuot alienum lanlaidas. So use your own property as not to injure another's property. So at this point, let us now proceed to the power of eminent domain. What is the power of eminent domain? In the case of DPWH versus Posadas III, the Supreme Court of the Philippines defined eminent domain as the power of the state, or this the ultimate right of the sovereign power to appropriate not only public but private property of citizens within the territorial sovereignty for public purpose. Under the 1987 Philippine Constitution, Article 3, Section 9 provides that the private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. Thus, the requisites before a private property can be taken are the following: 1. The taking of private property. 2. That the taking must be for public use. And 3. That it must be with just compensation. First, the taking of property means a physical disposition of the owner of his actual property or its use. The utilization of the property must be in such a way as to deprive the owner of beneficial enjoyment of his property. Public use means for public purpose, public interest, public welfare, or public benefit. In the case of Ears of Juan Cardona versus Reyes, the idea that public use means use by the public has been discarded by the court. At present, whatever may be beneficially employed for the general welfare satisfies the requirement for public use. Without just compensation means that the owner must be compensated for his property taken by the state. However, the compensation must be just. So what is then a just compensation? A just compensation is a fair and full equivalent of the loss which the owner has to suffer by reason of the expropriation. Usually, just compensation is the fair market value of the property. At this point, let us now move on to the power of taxation. What is the power of taxation? As defined, the power of taxation is to enforce proportional contributions from persons and property levied by the state by virtue of its sovereignty for the support of the government and for all public needs. In other words, taxation is a mode of raising revenues for public purpose. So there are two main purposes of taxation. One is for revenue or fiscal purposes, and number two is for non-revenue or regulatory purposes. At this point, let us now proceed to the rationale behind the power to tax. So why does the state need its citizens to pay taxes? The rationale of the power of taxation is the so-called lifeblood doctrine. Accordingly, taxes are what we pay for civilized society. Without taxes, the government would be paralyzed for lack of the motive power to activate and operate. Hence, despite the natural reluctance to surrender part of one's hard-earned income to the taxing authorities, every person who is able to must contribute his share in the burden of running the government. The government, for its part, is expected to respond in the form of tangible and intangible benefits intended to improve the lives of the people and enhance their material and moral values. To simply put, it means that in return for the taxpayer's contribution, the taxpayer receives the general advantages and protection which the government affords the taxpayer and his property. In sum, the difference between the three powers are as shown in the table. So first, what can be regulated by these powers? For police power, it can regulate both liberty and property, while for eminent domain and taxation, it affects only property rights. With respect to who can exercise these inherent powers, police power and taxation are exercised only by the state, while the power of eminent domain may be exercised not just only by the state, but also by private entities. Next, for what purpose? So property taken in police power is usually noxious or intended for a noxious purpose and may thus be destroyed. While in eminent domain and taxation, the property is wholesome and devoted to public use or purpose. With respect to compensation, in the exercise of police power, no compensation is necessary. Citizens are expected to have an altruistic attitude for the public good. In eminent domain, the compensation is the full and fair market value or market equivalent of the property taken. While in taxation, although taxpayers are not compensated, but the government is expected to provide protection and improvements instituted for the public good. In conclusion, although the inherent powers of the state may be exercised without constitutional grant, but it can certainly be limited by constitutional fiat. As such, there are certain limitations imposed by the Constitution in the exercise of these inherent powers of the state.